Hi everyone. So I've had a couple of questions recently which have kind of converged for me into something that I think is worth making a video about. The first was whether there was any lore background to the Vedrolfnir and Darkscale conflict in the Darkscale fate chain in the Churning Mists, and the second was whether there have been any pieces of lore or allusions so far in Heavensward that I have found really interesting but haven't had quite enough substance to make a full video about. So what I've decided to do, and it will contain Vedrolfnir and Darkscale, is a brief lore spotlight, firstly on the Dravanian Horde in general, and secondly on the specific etymologies of the various named Dravanians we see throughout Heavensward, particularly in the Forelands and the Churning Mists. As Midgardsormr explained to us during the main scenario, he travelled through space with 7 eggs and settled on a young Heidelin, taking it upon himself to ward this beautiful new star. His children spread across the lands, and while Bahamut and Tiamat travelled to Mericidia, Hreysvelgr, Ratatoskr and Nidhogg settled upon Ablathia's spine. Aeons later, the children of these great worms have become embroiled in war with the Ishgardians and their ancestors, with only a brief reprieve of 200 years earned by Saint Shiva and her love for Hreysvelgr. Following the murder of Ratatoskr, Nidhogg's eternal and poetic vengeance has pivoted around the latent essence of Ratatoskr, which every child of Ishgard has inherited from their ancestors, whom feasted on her eyes. If they ingest any quantity of dragon's blood, they are transformed into draconic hybrids. I know this is Eorzean History 101, but it's important to remember our context here. The Dravanian Horde then is made up of 2 different groups. The offspring of the 3 great worms, of whom Nidhogg was seemingly the most prolific, and the corrupted, converted, turned, whatever you want to call them, Ishgardians, which make up the majority of the lesser mindless shock troops. I'll come back to these soon. If you've missed the other videos and places during which I've discussed this, to put it tersely, Nidhogg sits below the World Tree of Norse myth in the Darkest Hells, consuming the corpses of oath-breakers and cowards, whilst on the highest branch of the tree perches an unnamed eagle, who is often conflated in popular culture with the giant Hreysvelgr, whom also takes the form of an eagle. Ratatoskr is a gossip-mongering squirrel that travels the length of the tree, carrying messages between the 2 of them. For more detail on Nidhogg in particular, check out my lore tour of the Eyrie. So many of the various kinds of dragons we have are pretty familiar to us and common throughout popular fantasy, like worms, wyverns, drakes, voivur, which are just baguette-eating wyverns, avis, amphibtyr, which are winged serpents in European folklore, and so on, and others like the tyrannosaur, whose allusions are very obvious. Before we get into the uniquely named dragons, there are, however, a few common mob types among the Horde with more interesting names. Firstly, we have already seen Ishgardians transforming into these, Sirikta. These are the first of 2 classes of Dravanian, which I believe are almost exclusively made up of transformed men and women. The Sepulenia Sirikta is an ancient hymenopteran insect from the Mesozoic era, which covered the Cretaceous, Jurassic, Triassic periods. Most of the fossils we have seen of these date to about 200 million years ago. The other Ishgardian Dravanian hybrid is, I believe, the Avis, meaning ages in Latin. This is another form we have seen the heretics taking, and they are called Dran Songar in the Dravanian tongue, sharing a qualifier with the Sirikta, which are called Ned Songar in the Eyrie, which leads me to believe that Songar is, in the dragon language, a way of identifying and designating these hybrids. There is another class among the common Dravanians named for an arthropod. The Vinegaroon, or whip scorpion, is a common name for the arachnid order Thelephonida. A warning here: if arachnids make you squeamish, hit the annotation to skip ahead. As you can see, they closely resemble a scorpion, but rather than having a venom-loaded sting, they have a whip-like tail which can spray a defensive acid with a vinegar-like smell. They are quite common, I believe, in Mexico, but you won't find any of these in Australia. They were not even remotely deadly enough to qualify for the Australian Arachnid Club. The small flitting Tullahand is another name for the Krat or Puck, a kind of old Estonian hay golem that could be made by giving 3 drops of blood to the devil in order to have it animated. They were flying creatures tasked with menial chores and labours, but if they were left without work, they had a penchant to attack their owners. The method for ridding oneself of a Talahand was generally to give it an impossible task or one that would see it burned or otherwise destroyed. Finally, of the lesser Dravanians, we have the Archaeonus, and to be fair, I'm not even certain that this qualifies as a dragon. The Archaeonus seems to be a mixture of the Anchionus, or near birds, and the Archaeopteryx, or ancient feather. Both of these are late Jurassic specimens assumed to represent that transitory period in evolution between dinosaurs and birds. It is possible that they might imply a similar transitory state between dragons and birds on Heidelin. Perhaps birds are the result of a long dilution of the blood of Midgardsormr and an end result of the way the subsequent generations seem to become ever smaller and less powerful. Now for the uniquely named Dravanians, which tend to be taken from various folklores and mythologies rather than historical taxonomies. I would like to make it clear that this is not an exhaustive list, but a collection of the dragons that I've seen as I've travelled across the Forelands and the Churning Mists over the past few weeks and found particularly interesting. To keep this list neat, we'll approach it in a loosely alphabetical order. Agathos is one of the A-rank marks in the Churning Mists. In Greek, agathos is a masculine adjective for good, but the deeper allusion here is to the Agatha demon, an attendant spirit of grain fields, farms, and vineyards, and a name later taken by an Alexandrian cartographer in the 2nd century and a Roman Egyptian alchemist another century later remembered for developing arsenic-based poisons. The other Churning Mists A-rank is named Bune, named for a Duke of Hell described in the Lesser Key of Solomon as a dragon with 3 heads of a dog, a griffin, and a man. As he is traditionally a kind of dragon-man hybrid and represented here in Heavensward as one of the Surikta or Ned Sorn Gar, I think this consolidates our theory that this is a class of primarily former Ishgardian Dravanians. Fjalar is a worm featured in a fate near Zenith and one of the only servants of Hreisvelga we meet in the Mists, maintaining a vigil over Zenith in his master's absence. In Norse myth, he is one of the roosters that crows to signify the beginning of Ragnarok in the Poetic Edda, the other being Galenkambi. Fjalar is also the name of one of the dwarven brothers whom killed the giant Kvasir and made from his blood the mead of poetry, which could grant anyone incredible inspiration and was coveted even by Odin. Another Norse rooster is named Vidofnir, or Wind Weaver, shining like a thunderstorm, crowing at dawn to declare the victory of light over darkness. Gandarewa is another former Ishgardian, apparently one that became seduced by a Near Eastern cult and partook of dragon blood after fleeing to Dravania, and the Churning Mists S-rank mark. He was a Persian sea monster that jealously guarded the magical healing Halma plant and was defeated by Kerasaspa in a battle that lasted 9 days. Glykon is a child of Tiamat and is the deity of a probably Macedonian snake cult focused on fertility and a supposed incarnation of Asclepius. The 2nd century writer Lucian of Samosata seems to think that it was an elaborate ruse for the cult's founder to get himself laid. This Glykon, however, seems to be the exception to our Surikta rule. Gusidr is another fate mob determined to destroy ancient Ishgardian monuments, and an Albanian water witch that can transform herself into a fire-spitting dragon. She pisses in people's water supplies to poison them and can only be appeased with human sacrifices. Minoruja was the bane of the Dusk Vigil before the Calamity, apparently responsible for the massacre of many knights. It is also the Arabic word for a snake's nose and a star in the head of the Hydra constellation. Pilrasta is a Forelands A-rank, named for a Dungeons & Dragons enemy, an ancient tyrannosaur that has lived for more than 1,000 years and mutated, incredibly aggressive, about 20 tons, 100 feet long, and strong enough to kill elder dragons. Rustaban is a champion of Darkscale. It means snake's head in Arabic, and he is the common name for Beta Draconis, a star in the head of the Draco constellation. Darkscale's second captain, Thuban, is taken from the same constellation, the common name for Alpha Draconis. Scytalis is a Churning Mists B-rank and appears in medieval English bestiaries as a slow-moving serpent that had such a beautiful scaled back that the viewer would be stunned, allowing it to steadily approach and consume them. Stihi, a fate dragon in the Western Highlands, is an Albanian treasure-hoarding dragon, an interesting figure but one that I haven't been able to find anything substantial on. Svarog has led countless assaults against the Broom since the ward surrounding Ishgard fell. He was an ancient Slavic god of fire, blacksmithing, and supposed to have been the very personification of sunlight and equivalent to the Roman god Vulcan or the Greek Hephaestus. Tarrasque is the monster responsible for the numerous craters in the Forelands and apparently enjoys cannonballing off the mountain. The French folklore surrounding Saint Martha takes the Tarrasque to have been some kind of dragon-turtle hybrid with the head of a lion, charmed by the saint, whom subsequently converted all of the local townsfolk to Catholicism. A town in Provence is now named Tarascon after the legend. Although Tioman is the final encounter in Somme Al, I'm not sure whether they'll do a lore tour on that dungeon anytime soon, and so I think the consort of Nidhogg is worth noting here. Pulau Tioman is a small Malaysian island and apparently a beautiful holiday destination. Local legend tells that it was once a dragon princess traveling from China to Singapore, stopping to rest in the crystal clear sea and deciding to remain there forevermore. Wargil is a name for the rainbow serpent of the Aboriginal Australians, one of the very oldest continuing religious symbols in the world, portrayed in rock paintings for at least 50,000 years. During the Dreamtime, the era during which the Aboriginal creation myths occur, the rainbow serpent formed mountains, valleys and rivers as it slithered across the land. It is considered the keeper of water, causing both rains and droughts. Finally, we come to Vidurfanir, the dragon that inspired this whole conversation. Darkscale is, as far as I can tell, a more ambiguous representation of the kind of figure that Nidhogg presents in mythology. Vidurfanir, however, is a hawk which sits between the eyes of the eagle we associate with Hraesvelgr, perched atop Yggdrasil, and it has been supposed that this hawk is either the instrument of the eagle's will, or else one which flies off to accrue forbidden knowledge of prophecy, not unlike the function of Odin's ravens. So that is a brief spotlight for you on some of the inspirations and allusions behind the Dravanian Horde. I hope you found it entertaining and educational, but to answer one of the original questions, yes, there are a lot of little pieces of lore and references throughout Heavensward that I think are really fascinating, but not necessarily substantial enough to dedicate a whole video to. But if you guys enjoyed this one, I'm sure I'll be able to arrange some of it more thematically and approach it with something like this once again. As for now, like and sub for more, share with your friends, and thank you so much for watching.